I've got some graphs in here, and sometimes when you go from one computer to another, they don't come out. But they look like they're okay, which is good. I just like to know about what the issues are before I get in the middle of a conversation and suddenly realize that things aren't the way I thought they were. Yeah, I'll bet. That's probably the nature of what you do, huh? That every system is a little bit different.
You would think they'd buy 50 of one type of computers instead of
I agree. I agree with you. I mean, even at the university, I mean, everybody's going to be independent and do their own thing, and they're going to, so we have Mac users, but then they have different.
Check 1, 2, 3.
You got the clicker, and it's ready to go. Are you gonna use it?
Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to get started here in a couple of minutes. So if you want to make your way in and find your favorite seat, we'll get started in about 2 minutes. All right, it looks like everybody's in the room, and we'll get started. My name is Courtney Thomas, and I'm the CEO of Great Plains SPCA, which is in the Kansas City area. We've got facilities in Kansas and Missouri, so it's a little complicated sometimes to tell you where we are. But it is my great pleasure this afternoon to introduce you to your speaker, who is Janet Scarlett. She's a veterinarian. She has her master's in public health and also her PhD. She is the founder of the Maddie's Shelter Medicine Program and is a professor of epidemiology at Cornell University. She and Dr. Leila Miller offered the first didactic course in shelter medicine at Cornell in 1999. Dr. Scarlett also participated in some of the first scientific studies on the reasons for pet relinquishment to shelters, and she's published on numerous shelter-related issues, including pediatric neutering, feline upper respiratory tract infections, and the effectiveness of spay-neuter programs. Her current interest is the use of shelter metrics to set and evaluate goals. How exciting is that? She's on the board of directors for the National Council on Pet Populations and is on the planning team for the National Council's Research Day. CATS, the ins and outs, improving their future through research, which will be launched November 10th of 2013, just prior to the SAWA 2013 annual conference. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jan Scarlett.
Thank you, Courtney. I normally teach statistics as one of my roles at the veterinary college at Cornell, and I always seem to get slighted either for an 8 o'clock class or a post-lunch down class. And if you think it isn't difficult to talk about numbers and statistics with people who have just come off of lunch, it can be a challenge. So I'm going to try to keep you awake. Around about 2:10 or so, I'd like to maybe just take a stretch break so that you can all stand up. An hour and a half is a long time to sit, especially if we're talking about numbers, at least for some of you. So this is the look I often get from our veterinary students. Why? I did not come to veterinary school to look at numbers. The other response I often get is one that I think is reflected in Mark Twain's autobiography, in which he talks about figures often beguiling him, particularly when he's been arranging them himself, and in which case the remark attributed to Benjamin Disraeli, the great statesman and former prime minister in Great Britain, who wrote, "There are 3 kinds of lies: lies, damned lies, and statistics." So what I'd like to do today is talk about using statistics not to misrepresent what's going on, but to help you understand better what's happening in your shelters, such that on the basis of that knowledge, using that rational thought that we heard about this morning, that we can make rational decisions. When I reread this quote the other day, preparing for this lecture, I was reminded of a conversation I had. This was probably about 10 years ago, 9-10 years ago. And I was attending a conference, I think it was an American Humane Association conference back when we had AHA conferences. And I went up to a salesperson for a representative for Chameleon, the shelter software program. And I was asking him about, I told him what I would really like to do is to answer certain questions using data in Chameleon, and how could one do that? And I was talking with him, and he was struggling clearly with what I was asking him about. And I thought I was asking some very straightforward questions. And he would answer with a response that I'd go like, where did that come from? And clearly he was distressed. He was trying to communicate with me, and I was trying to communicate with him. And then he stopped for a moment, and he said, oh, I get it. You want to use the data to look at the truth. And I went, well, yeah, but it taught me a lesson, because I think we all, and I'm not disparaging of this, that we want to present our shelters in the best light possible. And we have to demonstrate to our donors that we're doing a good job, because otherwise they may not give us more money. And so I think sometimes we stretch the truth a little bit with some of the numbers, or we conceal some of the numbers and present other numbers. And I'm not saying that's bad, because I understand the milieu in which you work. But what I would like to make a plea to you to do is to, when you're actually doing your planning, when you're there as your administrative team, when you're there working with your staff, that you don't mask the numbers at that point, and that you don't end up kind of fooling yourself and believing your own misrepresentation. That you look at the data in a way that will help you make the wisest decisions for going forward with your organizations. So what I'd like to say is, how many of you collect data and put it into a software package? Who doesn't collect data in your shelter and put it into a software package? So presumably, it all didn't add up to 100%, but presumably most of you are using, if not all of you, are using data. And as you well know, data collection is time-consuming and expensive. Even for your shelters that are using a package that you yourself may not be paying for, you are paying staff to put that data in. And what often happens with software packages, whether it's in the sheltering area or whether it's in medical facilities like the one I work in, is that they give you the opportunity to put lots and lots of information in. And I often attribute that to our designers of the databases, because they're thinking about and they're asking questions about, what do you want in? What do you want in? What they often fail to ask is, what do you want to get back out? Because why else would you have a database into which you were putting information if in fact you didn't use it? Then you're wasting resources getting it in. And so what I'd like you to think about is not so much about how much data you're going to collect, but what data are you going to collect that helps you influence the thinking and actions that will help your facility. And so maybe you don't have to have data in every data field if in fact you're not going to use that information. And I can't tell you what information that is, because you're all different and you all have different views and different goals in your facilities. But I would ask you to think about it. And again, the old business, if I don't have time. Well, if something is important, as we heard this morning, you make time to do it. So be thoughtful and parsimonious. Think about what it is you really want to use. So what I'd like to do today is to just suggest And I do mean suggest, because I know that not all of you have the same goals. And so no one size is going to fit everyone. But you should be thinking about what are your goals, and of those goals, which ones can you use metrics to help you assess whether or not you're making progress toward those goals. Or God forbid, you're even losing ground in making progress to those goals. So I certainly, for those of you who may be already doing a lot of these, more power to you. I apologize for the redundancy. But I hope that there are a few things that I suggest that perhaps you aren't doing. And my list is by no means exhaustive, okay? It's just some of the things I think that you can be doing to hope you then go home and say, hey, at least maybe 2 or 3 of these I'm going to implement and start looking at on a regular basis. And that's the other point I wanted to make, is that we want to use these data not just once a year, but along the way, maybe monthly. Maybe at one of your staff meetings once a month, people in each of the areas for which you are collecting metrics are responsible themselves for pulling that data and sharing it with the group and how they're doing. Okay, so the value of goal setting. I'm probably like the ministers preaching to the choir, because those of you who head up organizations or have managerial positions in organizations know the value of goal setting. You do it when you fundraise. We're going to raise $100,000 this year, or with this particular event. You do it when you say you launch a capital campaign, or you are interested in hiring somebody. You're going to add a veterinarian to the staff. So you set goals, and then you work toward achieving those goals. And I think goals have the advantage of doing all of these things, but the one I really I really value in this is it causes you to say, how am I going to get there? What's my plan for getting there? Which means you have to stop and think. You have to say, what steps do I have to get to go through in order to get there? And the other thing I'd like you to think about is, if you set a goal, then when are you going to actually set a time that you're going to actually sit back and say, did I get there? Or what progress have I made to getting there? These are, I think, common goals to most, if not all, shelters. To reduce the intake of animals over time, to provide for the very best welfare. We are humane organizations. We want to provide for the best care of our animals while they're with us. And we want to release as many animals as possible. So I just picked out 3 big goals. These are obviously not the only goals you have, but common to most shelters. And one of the approaches, there are a whole lot of paradigms in thinking about goal setting, but this is one of them. It's called the SMART approach. And the SMART stands for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bounded. And today, what I'd like to do is talk especially about that the goals you set are very specific, and I'll give you some examples. And I'm talking today particularly about those goals that you can measure with metrics. Obviously, not every goal you do measure with metrics, but the ones I'd like to talk about are those that are. And the other thing, although I won't spend a lot of time talking about it, is set a date when you're going to look to see how you did. Maybe it's 6 months from now. Maybe it's 3 months from now. Maybe it's a year from now. But you have a set date. We're going to come back to this goal, and we're going to look at, and hopefully metrics is one of the ways that you're going to assess whether you have achieved that goal, or at least the progress toward that goal. If you look at those metrics and you're not making progress, then it doesn't mean you necessarily give up on the goal. You just go back to the drawing board and say, why aren't we getting there? Maybe it's not specific enough. Maybe our plan was flawed to begin with. Okay? All right. So we talked about most shelters having the goal of reducing intake. My question is it always the goal that you want to reduce intake? Are there some circumstances where, in fact, intake may go up, and that's a good thing? So, for example, what if you have hired a new cruelty investigator? That person is a real hot shot. They've gone out into the community, and in fact, they're doing a better job of finding cruelty cases and bringing them to a point where you can seize the animals. Maybe that's a good thing. And lumping seized animals in with the animals that are coming out of the community where you have active spay-neuter efforts where you're trying to drive those numbers down, if you mix the two, you may, in fact, help to obscure your progress toward your goal within those community animals. Similarly, what if, I work in the Northeast, we have a lot of animals coming from the south up to the Northeast now. And as we've looked at some of the data with regards to dogs, for example, we're seeing in some of the northeastern shelters where we had had declines going on now for well over a decade in the number of dogs coming into our shelter, suddenly we see a spike upwards. Well, if you start looking at why are you seeing a spike upwards, by gosh, it's because they're beginning to bring animals in. And that's not a bad thing. That shouldn't count against your efforts or your spay-neuter efforts in your own community. So why am I talking about this? It's because when you start looking at metrics to assess your progress, then be sure you're looking at the metrics that are appropriate to the question you're asking. So that may mean that you don't look at an overall intake if your goal is to assess whether or not intake in your community of cats are coming down. Maybe instead you restrict that question to, well, among owner-surrendered stray and returned owner cats, how much have we reduced that intake this year? So refining your question, making it very specific so that you can look at the right data, the correct data that really addresses the question. Okay, so this is just to make the point that oftentimes animals that are seized, animals in special programs, service in and clinic in groups, depending on how you use those categories or if you even have those in your software, certainly owner-requested euthanasias and animals dead on arrival, are often animals you want to pull out out of all of your questions. So using your software to pull those out before you look at the metrics is going to give you a much clearer sense of whether or not you're making progress. Okay. So the other point before we actually get into some of the nitty-gritty is remember that it's a team effort, that when you're working in the shelter, it's a team effort to keep all of those animals healthy, to have the best possible welfare for all animals in your shelter. It's a team effort to ensure that you're helping to diminish the intake into your shelters. And so just the administrative staff looking at metrics, I think is missing an opportunity to share with the very people who are helping you either the progress or the lack thereof and the plan that you have to try to address that, or maybe even soliciting from them some of their ideas about how you could go about doing it. So I'm a big advocate of at least once a month, and maybe more frequently than that, in your staff meetings, share some of your data with these people. Share them with the volunteers. We'll talk a little bit later on about some of the metrics we can use to look at disease at the population level. What proportion of cats walking through the door in your shelters get sick with upper respiratory tract infection? Who influences that? Everybody who touches that cat influences that, including the kennel staff, even volunteers, etc. So they all have a role to play in reducing that and working to minimize those levels. So share that data when you have it, and make them responsible for helping you get that data. You as the administrators or one person, just because they happen to have the access to the database that you're using, doesn't have to be the only one responsible for that. We can teach people to pull the data that they need to so that the work is spread out. Okay. So if you can think about the system, the shelter in the form of a dynamic system. We have animals coming in, we have animals passing through the shelter, and we have animals leaving. So it's a dynamic system that is constantly in motion. And what I'd like to do, I'm going to start a little bit ass backwards, I apologize. I was asked to speak about kind of what happens with metrics within the shelter and going out. I'm going to start with outflow because I think it's perhaps a little bit more clear what some of the metrics are with this one. So, release as many animals as possible from the shelter, or maximize the proportion of animals that leave alive. I think the most common metric, at least in our experience, has been the use of the live release rate. And the live release rate is essentially all of those good things that can happen to animals. They're adopted, they're returned to their owners, they're transferred over, those animals plus those that we have to euthanize. And it rightly so removes the owner-requested euthanasias and dead on arrival because they aren't pertinent to that question. It also excludes animals that die or are lost in the shelter's care. And we have encountered some shelters, fortunately very, very small proportion of shelters, where in fact they have not wanted to tamper with their euthanasia statistics or didn't know any better, and overcrowded, had animals die in the cages, and in fact their overall live release rate looked pretty good because it's not reflected in that. And so what you need to remember is this live release rate looks at the outcome of animals among those that have had an outcome, but they exclude the lost and the died in shelter. Now, for those of you those of you in the audience that are probably well-run shelters, you have very few of these animals that die or are lost. And so your rates, your live release rates, are going to look pretty much the same, whether you include those that died or those that are lost. And the other nice thing about the live release rate is 1 minus the live release rate is your euthanasia rate. And now remember, that's the euthanasia rate among those animals that have experienced an outcome. And then you can look at your adoptions, the proportion of adoptions among your outcomes, or the proportions of transfers, et cetera. The other limitation to the live release rate in our thought processes is that they don't account for the animals that are still remaining in the shelter. And if you think about it, there are really only 3 possible dispositions at the end of any particular interval. At the end of the year, at the end of the month. Either there's been a good outcome, they've been adopted, etc. It's an undesirable outcome, they've been died, lost, or been euthanized. And I do recognize that there are some euthanasias, I'm going to lump them sort of generally speaking as an undesirable outcome, fully recognizing that there are some deaths that you can't prevent, and there are also some animals that need to be euthanized. So recognizing that, but still in general saying we'd like to at least minimize that euthanasia rate. And then, or they can still remain in the shelter. So if you come into if you're an animal in the shelter system, you have to have, at the end of an interval, be in one of those categories. So who's then eligible for an outcome? They're going to be animals that at the beginning of the year, if we're talking about a year interval, because they were there at the beginning of the year, plus those that came in. It's among those animals that we're going to see some kind of a disposition. They can either still be there at the end of the year, they can have had an undesirable outcome, or they could have had a positive or desirable outcome. And what that, to me, is, and I don't know, you may not share this same sentiment, but that tells me the probability. I can now say, of all the animals that were handled in this shelter, what's the probability that an animal will be euthanized? What's the probability that this animal will walk out the door? And I suspicion that the consumers of the live release rate also look at those when you tell them our euthanasia rate is 20%. They're thinking, well, 20% of the animals that walk through the door are going to be euthanized. No, it's 20% among those that have had a disposition that will be euthanized. And here you've got, if you look at those 3 axes, that is the proportion that are released alive, the proportion that are have an undesirable outcome and those still in shelters, these ought to add up to 100% at the end of any interval. And so you can monitor, are you beginning to accumulate animals? Do you have a high proportion of animals that really are still remaining in your shelter, which can be one measure of efficiency of animals moving through the shelter. Now, obviously, at the end of a year, these numbers are going to be pretty small, at least we hope they are, in relation to everybody who came in and everybody who was still there at the beginning of the year. But as you make that interval shorter, at the end of the month, a higher proportion of those animals are still going to be in shelter, right? Because they just haven't had time to move on through. So, and if you want to refine this even more, then you can look at, well, what's the probability that a dog walking into this shelter in 2011 would be adopted? It's about 48.6%. What's the probability that a dog would be euthanized in this shelter? 10.8%. What's the probability that an animal walking into that shelter would still remain at the end of the year? About 4%. Now, I'm not saying that there isn't a use for live release rate. And I'm not suggesting that you not use live release rate. I just want you to understand what it means, and I want you to convey to people what that means. But I do like this because it gives you the total picture of what happened to the animals in your care during that interval. One note here, I did one thing. This is actually not the proportion of all of these, but rather it's a bugaboo of mine that we talk about the return to owner rate, and usually most shelters that we've worked with do the number of animals that return to their owner divided by all of either all of the animals that had an outcome or all of the animals that had come through the shelter. And that doesn't make any sense to me in the sense that the owner surrendered animal or the transferred in animal isn't going to go back to their owner. Or at least for the most part. Yes, you get a few return to owners owner surrenders who change their mind. So what I've done here is adjusted the denominator. And this is a shelter where, in fact, if you looked at the total population as the denominator, you get somewhere around 3%. And that's what we report for a lot of cats. We say cats are somewhere around 2 to 4% return to owner rates. When I look at the data for most shelters that report that, they haven't looked at that as a proportion of the strays. Now, not that 8.8% is great for cats, but it's better than 3%, and it's a more accurate description of what proportion of animals you're actually getting back to their owners. And in this particular shelter, it masked, if you didn't correct for the fact that the stray proportion had changed, in fact, you didn't see that they had made some progress in getting cats back to their owners. So I encourage you to look at the return to owner rates with regards to stray and make that correction. Okay. So I want to go back here for just a minute. So what I did here was, since I was really interested in how well we were doing among community animals, ones that were surrendered to us, that came in as strays, or that came in and were returned to their owner, I took out seizures and DOAs, obviously, special programs and what have you, when I did these rates, because I didn't think they were pertinent to the question that I was asking when I was looking at this data. But it's not that I don't think that we should look at how we're doing with seized animals. It's just that I think you need to look at a different profile, because you're asking a different question. You're asking usually different questions, and you usually have different goals with regards to your seized animals. So instead, we did an outcome profile also for seized animals in that same shelter. Okay, does that make sense to you? That we restrict the animals we look at to the questions that we're actually, and to the groups of animals that we really want the answers for those questions about. Okay, so we haven't really talked about those animals that are still in shelter. Why should we even pull them out and look at them separately? This is a busy slide, but what I want to get across here is that if your exit numbers are higher chronically than your so if your outcome numbers, your animals leaving the shelter are consistently lower than those coming in, you're going to start to accumulate animals. And we've seen this as an insidious process in a lot of shelters because people don't want to make some hard decisions. Sometimes they're not moving animals through very efficiently. And so their intake begins to exceed their outflow, and we get an accumulating number of animals. If you use the live release rate, and I don't want you to concentrate too much on all these numbers, just to show you that essentially the intake is the same in these shelters. What's different about these two shelters is that we're beginning to get animals accumulate here. That essentially the same numbers are being euthanized, same numbers are being saved within a couple of numbers. But what's different is that we have more and more animals. This is still in the shelter at the beginning of September. These are the animals that are still in the shelter at the end of the interval. So they're not going down and they're going up a little bit. Look at their live release rate. It remains almost identical. There's no statistical difference between those two live release rates. But if you come down here and look at our distribution of animals by the probabilities, you see that in fact 33% in September still remain, 33% of the animals that had been in that shelter at any time remain in that shelter at the end of the month. Whereas here we have only 14% of the animals remaining in the shelter. The probability, if you're in this shelter in September, of getting out alive in September is 67.7%. 2 out of 3 chances of getting out alive. Now, they may still get out alive down here. They're still in shelter. We don't know what's going to happen to them. We'd like to believe that they're still in the shelter, that the predominance of those will eventually, the next month or the next interval, get adopted. So you could say, well, we release 67% or 68%, plus we have another 14% that we're still waiting for something to happen, but on average, 90% of our animals that remain still in the shelter get adopted, or whatever that number is. Whereas here, you only have a 52% chance of getting out alive in that month. I'm not saying they couldn't get out in another month, but in that month, they aren't going to get out. And usually this is associated with longer lengths of stay, because you're beginning to accumulate animals and you can't move them out as quickly. And then you now have an actual estimate of the probability of being euthanized during that month. So another way of looking at your data. If you do this, you can kind of follow what's going on in your shelter over time. The blue are the live release proportion. It doesn't matter what you call it. I've just tried to distinguish it from live release rate. The probability of being euthanized, the probability of still being in the shelter. And this was a shelter that was trying to diminish the number of animals, that were left, and to increase or decrease the length of time that the animals were spending in the shelter and get animals through more quickly. I did these, you saw these, I did those sort of at the shelter level. I think it's important to think about, and probably more helpful to look at these by age group, because often what happens to our kittens is different than what happens to our cats. We often have higher adoption rates for our kittens than we do for our cats. Similarly, there's often differences between puppies and adults. Maybe it's important, if you're dealing with a lot of bully breeds, that in fact your adoption rates look different from your bully breeds than from others. And if you do start subsetting these, what our experience has been is that you begin to understand better what's going on, and you can better target your resources to help those animals that are not doing as well as other subgroups. So breaking those numbers down by age group, by very basic demographic characteristics. By that I mean things like age group, like source. Often our strays do differently in some ways than our owner-surrendered dogs. Bully breeds, another one. The other thing you can look at is the Asilomar status, certainly looking at reasons for euthanasia. I think most of you are doing that, looking carefully at why you're euthanizing. You can do the same thing for these subgroups depending on what your questions are. This is a shelter where over the last several years we have seen, and this says this is at outcome, but we've also looked at this Asilomar status at intake, which pretty much mirrors this, is that we're seeing that with the economic downturn in our community, that we're getting more sick animals brought in. People are having to relinquish those animals because they can't afford veterinary care. And so what's happening is that we're getting a higher proportion of animals that are unhealthy and untreatable. And we can track that and look and actually quantify it. It's not just tracking it, but quantifying what proportion of animals. And you may or may not be able to change that, but you can certainly then plan better for it. You can plan and understand that your medical needs, your resources that you're going to need for medical care for these animals is quite likely to be higher, and probably going to even go higher. For those of you who are getting where you're saving treatable animals, what proportion of your animals are now treatable? How are you going to plan to provide veterinary and medical care for those increasing numbers of animals? So by using the metrics to help inform what you're doing, hopefully you're doing a better job. Hopefully you're not caught short and saying, oh my gosh, we're 3/4 of the way through the year and we've already over budget in our veterinary budget. So the metrics help you to better understand and then make adjustments as you're going along. So I'd next like to talk about and focus on the animal shelter itself. What about what's happening within the shelter? And remember, you have animals moving in that shelter all the time, or you should. And I'd like to believe, although I've been in a few shelters where I wonder whether, in fact, part of their mission really is to keep the animals in their care and provide for the best possible welfare. I have a feeling that sometimes shelters lose track of the fact that if you as a humane organization can't do this, why are you calling yourself a humane organization, and how can you set an example for other people in your community if you yourself can't provide humane care? So I would hope that this is a goal of yours. So what contributes to poor welfare? Well, lots of things can contribute to poor welfare, obviously. Stress. We're investing a lot of time and effort in trying to keep our animals behaviorally healthy, address those things that stress them, provide enriched environments. Obviously, poor sanitation, poor nutrition, all of these things. But what I'd like to spend time today talking about are the top three. The time that animals spend in the shelter, whether or not you are exceeding your capacity to provide care for those animals in that shelter, and the disease levels that are happening in those shelters. Because I think that they are among the most influential factors that influence the welfare of the animals in your care. And what kind of metrics, then, can we use to help us? And remember, metrics are only a tool. This is one tool in your toolbox of things that you're doing to try to enhance the quality of life of the animals that are with you. So let's talk about time spent in the shelter. And incidentally, there are any number of different synonyms. I think Dr. Hurley and Dr. Newberry like the term flow-through time. I think that's very descriptive. I think it tells you that you're talking about how long does it take for these animals to flow through your shelter. And here, what we've done is, let's see if I can get this. So first of all, we've looked at, well, what is the overall length of stay of animals in your care? And I've taken dogs here. I've separated owner-surrendered from stray because that makes sense to me. In the area in which this shelter was located, they have a 5-day mandatory hold on dogs that are brought to the shelter if they're stray. So obviously, if you lump those two together and look at your overall length of stay, depending on what proportion of, you've got 90% of your animals stray, 10% owner surrendered, you're going to have a longer length of stay, generally speaking, than somebody who has 20% stray and 80% owner surrenders. So I think it makes some sense to target those two groups separately. But that's not the only answer to the time that animals spend in your shelter. And in our experience, I mean, there's going to be a point at which you can't lower this more, because this is time in the shelter. What we're striving to do is minimize the time in the shelter while being consistent with the mission of your shelter. So if the mission of your shelter is to get animals spayed and neutered while they're with you, if they come in unaltered, or if you believe that you're going to be providing some kind of behavioral support for animals that are in need of that support, then that's what your mission is. And there's going to be some limit to the point at which you can no longer drive that time in the shelter down any further. So I'm not suggesting that you just, I mean, if you euthanized everything that came through the door, then you could have a really, really short time in shelter. But that's not what I'm talking about, okay? But most shelters that we've been working with, in fact, all of the shelters we've been working with, we have realized that they could be more efficient, that they could move those animals through more quickly. And one of the ways that you can use, again, the data that you're already collecting is to look at, well, where's the hang-up? Where are we spending time that perhaps we could trim off, that we could do a better job at? We could make that time shorter. And obviously, these don't necessarily pertain to every circumstance. You may not have, you have some animals that don't go through spay-neuter, so they may not contribute to that. These are just some ideas. You can think of others that you could actually measure. These are just examples. Yes?
On the slide that you were just looking at,
Yes.
what is it's all very compelling data, and so I'm thinking about what system did you use to track it? I mean, the system that we use, you can track through stages, but
Right,
I'm not
right,
sure the
right, right.
collective report goes.
So the question was, how do you get these data? Can I hold that question? Because that's the $64,000 question that is going to pertain to almost everything I'm talking about, okay? I mean, not almost everything, but a lot of the things. And I'm hoping we have some of the people of software representatives in the room that can help, because it all depends on which software package you're using. And I'm not familiar with all of the software packages. And so I'd like to kind of open that up to getting to that question, because obviously this is all fine and great, but if you can't do it, where do we go from there? Okay, good question. So thinking about what I'd like you to think about is that every animal that comes through your shelter follows some kind of a path. If it's already altered, then that animal doesn't have to go through spay-neuter. If you don't do behavioral evaluations on cats, you may not have to pass through that particular evaluation. But every animal has some kind of a path. And being conscious of what those paths are is one of the keys to trying to shorten the overall average length of stay. So keeping this in mind and trying to be very conscious of what that is, and having somebody responsible at some level for each animal and trying to assess where they are and keep them moving is part of the key to getting at shortening length of stay. But I want to take just a minute and try to convince you, if you haven't already, or if you aren't already convinced, that length of stay contributes to poor welfare. And we now have, this is from one study, but there are now numerous studies showing, at least in cats, and actually there's one in dogs as well, that the longer, at least within the first 2 weeks, that a cat is in a shelter, the more likely it is to develop an upper respiratory tract infection. And so the way you'd read this is if you started with 100 cats, by day 5, roughly 12, in this particular shelter, roughly 12% of those cats would have developed upper respiratory. By the 10 days, roughly almost 50% of those cats would have developed upper respiratory disease. Now, this isn't true of every shelter. This is true of this shelter. But in the shelters we've looked at, even though the actual percentages may be somewhat different, in fact, there is this increasing length of time. More stress, more opportunity for exposure, and what we end up seeing is a higher level of disease. Oops, wrong one. Certainly in your own shelters you've seen this, and there are publications that have now documented this, that for at least some animals, the longer they are in the shelter, the more likely it is that some of their behaviors begin to deteriorate. We work in an area where we have lots of pit bulls, and our pitties seem to be particularly prone to behavioral deterioration. Also, the other reason to look at length of stay is just a very kind of housekeeping one. That is, if we take a very simple situation, if we have a cage and we have it for 30 days, if we have one animal who stays in that cage for 30 days, we can house one animal there. But if we have that time that that animal spends in that cage, then we can put 2 animals in that same cage. And similarly, if you can drive this down to the point at which you're still consistent with your mission, then you're going to be able to house the maximal number of animals. And then, of course, the other one is, the longer they're there, the more it costs us per animal to take care of them, right? Just because we have to pay staff to be there to take care of each of those animals. So if you look at the cost per animal in your care, if you could shorten that, you could save money, at least on the per animal basis. And potentially invest that money in any number of different ways, depending on what needs are in your shelter. So what contributes to length of stay? All kinds of things contribute to length of stay, obviously. If you don't have enough staff to take care of animals and do the cleaning appropriately, and they start cutting corners, and then those animals get sick because their cleaning protocols have gone to heck. Just plain old poor organization. People don't know what they're supposed to be doing. They're not on their job. They're not efficient. Illness, too many animals, etc. But what I'd like to say is that also a contributing factor is that we're not paying attention to individual animals and what's happening to them, or enough attention, let me put it that way, such that we're not looking at every animal, hopefully every day, maybe every other day, depending on the volume that you have, and saying, what's happening with you? What's your next step? Are you moving? Maybe the answer is yes. Tomorrow she's scheduled for spay neuter. Next animal. But you're paying attention to each and every animal. And if there is something that needs to be done to move this animal onwards, then you're giving that responsibility to somebody. Somebody has that responsibility, and tomorrow they better report on what had happened. And although I'm not, I'll come back to that in a minute. So what we're looking for when we look at some of our metrics are the bottlenecks. What's keeping these animals from moving? Where are they stuck? We are not able to do the spay neuter in-house. We have to send them to a veterinarian in the community. And how much time does that add? How much money are we spending in doing that? Is there anything we can do to make that more efficient? And now you have a new goal, right? You have a new goal. It's taking us too long. Maybe it's something you bring to the board and you say, boy, in the next year, our goal will be to have an in-house veterinarian. But you've got, metrics can be very persuasive to people on boards. I sat on a board for 9 years. Very nice to see. Tell me, you say you need this now, but you also say you need this, 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 and this. It's the thing, oftentimes, that you have some data on, that you can persuade your board members that this really is a priority over this or this or this, because let me show you what's happening. So another reason to have those metrics is actually to leverage them against your needs, helping you set that goal and then finding the resources to do the goal. And we often start with the overall length of stay that's happening in your shelter. How many of you know what the overall length of stay is for your cats and for your dogs? I know a lot more shelters are doing this because a lot of the software packages now have the capability of giving you that information. But I think it's even more helpful if you can break that average length of stay into more revealing, more refined parts. So, for example, if you break it down by various events, you can find those bottlenecks. If you break it down by age group, you might find that, and Dr. Newberry talks about fast-tracking animals, that young, healthy kitten that's just come back from foster who can move right through, who should be brought up and just get that animal out of there. It's less likely to get sick. It's highly marketable. It's going to open up a cage. It's going to cost you less money to care for that animal on a daily basis. Go ahead and move that animal through. And you can look at your own data and decide where are the subgroups, who needs the most help. So we've already, what was my point on this one? I can't remember. That's bad. So how is length of stay calculated? How do you get length of stay? How do some of your packages get length of stay? That's a little bit mysterious even to me, because sometimes I'm not quite sure how some of the packages get these. Because there's various ways you could actually calculate it. So you could say among animals that entered the shelter in June, what was their average length of stay? That being from the time they leave or the time they come in to the time they leave. Or you could ask among animals that leave in June, what proportion or how long were they in the shelter? And we'll talk about it a little bit more when we talk about capacity, but there is, how long was any animal that was there in June actually there? And I think if you're just tracking your progress towards minimizing length of stay, that looking at, to me, it kind of makes most sense to say, among animals that came in the shelter in June, how long did they stay? How did that compare to animals that came in last June, or the June before that? Or how does that look in relation to animals that came in February? So I think you can use that to track and just to keep track of what's going on. And for those of you who are from Pet Point in the audience, maybe afterwards we can talk a little bit about this, but I have a suspicion that you do it that your lengths of stay that you normally calculate are from when they came in, what proportion of them stayed in the shelter. If they came in June, how long did they stay? If they went out in June, how long did they stay? Is that how it's done? You have your choice. You can choose that so that when you go in there, you can specify intake date or outcome date. Okay. All right. So I'm going to give us all about a 3-minute break in just a minute, but I want you to stay with me here for a minute. What I want you to see is when you use either the intake date, what was the length of stay when they came in, what was the length of stay if they went out, that you're talking about a subset of the animals that were in the shelter, okay? Because we always have some animals that came in, for example, if you're looking at length of stay among those that came in the shelter, then you're only looking at these two animals. By the way, these are the actual cats, and this horizontal line represents the amount of time that the cat was in the shelter. Does this make sense to you? Y'all, some of you are looking like, oh my goodness, what does that mean? So what this is supposed to depict is this cat came in on September 1 and stayed until about the 20th of September, and then it got sick. This cat, and then it was euthanized, let's say it was euthanized. This cat came in somewhere around the 10th and stayed till November, well, actually probably till October 31. So each of these represents a cat, and I'm just going to pretend that these are the only cats that were in the shelter. So if you do your length of stay based on intake, then you're looking at the animals, how long did they stay if they came in June. So this cat came in somewhere around the 12th and stayed through somewhere around the 20th of November. So its length of stay is the date it it left minus the date that it came in. Okay? Similarly, if you specified in your average length of stay only those animals, you said the outcome, well then you're looking at the length of stay of this animal that died, its length of stay from whenever it came in, and I don't have any others on there, right there. Or I guess this one here. What it doesn't encompass, and we'll talk about this with capacity, are those that actually were in the shelter but didn't either leave or come in during that month. Okay? And I think that's really going to be important when you talk about average length of stay and using it in capacity kinds of things. So I'm going to let's take a quick 3-minute break so you don't have to sit too long on your butts and you can take a stretch. While you're standing up, I want you to think about a question. You can talk about it among yourselves. What's the average length of stay tell you? What does it mean? Yeah, please. Or either one.